Y'all, Disney just committed the single dumbest act of corporate arrogance I have seen in the past 12 months, and that is a field with some fierce competition. They watched their own trailer get absolutely demolished by 149,000 dislikes against 53,000 likes, saw that 74% of every human being who clicked on that video chose to punch it in the mouth on the way out, and their official response was to turn around and tell the press that less than 5% of the conversation was negative. Less than 5%. Now, I want y'all to sit with that for a second. This is a company looking at a number that clear and bright, a number so big you could read it from the back of a hayfield in August, and deciding that what they are actually seeing is an optical illusion. That right there is not confidence. That is a company that has lost its mind. And here is what makes this worse than just a bad trailer getting a bad reaction. This ain't the first rodeo. Back in November of 2025, when Disney dropped the teaser for this same movie, the internet told them the exact same thing. That teaser pulled a 67% dislike ratio within its first 48 hours of being live. 67%. So Disney saw that number in November. They looked at it, they processed it, and their response was to spend 4 more months and come back out with a full trailer that somehow got the dislike ratio up to 74%. They did not improve a single thing. They took the feedback that every person who hated the teaser gave them for free, and they put it straight in the trash can. See, where I come from, if you ask the crowd what they want, and the crowd tells you, and you come back with something worse, that ain't called creative vision. That is called not listening. And not listening has a cost. Now, I want to make sure y'all understand what kind of numbers we are actually talking about here, because the dislike ratio is only part of the story. The other part is what happened with Lilo and Stitch just 10 months ago. That movie opened to $182.6 million over the Memorial Day weekend. Lilo and Stitch went to the Hawaiian island of Kauai. They shot on location. They respected the culture and the setting that gave the original story its soul. They cast a real Hawaiian girl as Lilo. Hair behind it. You could feel it on screen. Now flip that around and look at what happened with Moana. Disney filmed this movie at Trilith Studios in Fayetteville, Georgia. Fayetteville, Georgia. That is outside of Atlanta, y'all. A movie set in the sun-soaked waters of ancient Polynesia, where every rock and wave and breeze carries 10 centuries of culture behind it, was shot in a studio outside of Atlanta so the production could chase a tax incentive. One fan put it bluntly on social media. Shooting even 1 second of a Polynesian set movie in Atlanta ought to be a jailable offense. I ain't gonna go quite that far, but I understand the feeling. Because what that decision communicates to the audience is the same thing it communicates to anyone with common sense. This movie was built around what was convenient for the studio, not what was right for the story. And then you got the hair situation, which is where this whole thing goes from bad to absolutely head-scratching. Now, y'all already know about the wig on Dwayne Johnson, and I am going to talk about it. But I want to start with Moana's hair, because this is the part of the story that does not get enough attention, and it is frankly the part that makes the least sense of anything in this whole conversation. They cast a young actress named Catherine Laga'aia in the title role. She was a perfect choice. She is Samoan and Maori. She has natural curly hair. Her hair, naturally, without anybody doing a single thing to it, looks like Moana's hair. This was not an accident. They found the right person. They had the one thing they needed already built in. And then they straightened it. They took a girl with natural curls that matched the character and blew it out into something that, as fans on social media pointed out, looks like it was styled in a salon for someone who lives somewhere with electricity and no ocean wind. One commenter asked how in the world someone living on an island with salt water and no electricity would have hair that looks blow-dried. That is a fair question, and nobody at Disney has answered it. So here is what you ended up with. You got a bald man wearing a curly wig and a woman with curly hair wearing a straight blowout. They went out of their way in both directions to make sure neither character's hair was their own. They put fake curls on the person with no curls and took real curls away from the person who had them. And that right there is not just a styling problem. That is a decision-making problem. That is what happens when nobody in the room is asking the simple question, does this make sense? Because if somebody in that room had asked that question, they would have had to answer no. And if they answered no, they would have had to do something different. But nobody asked. Or if they did, nobody listened. And we're back to the not listening problem that started this whole conversation. Now let's talk about Maui and the wig, because I do want to give this its fair share of the discussion. When the animators were working on the original Moana back in 2016, the Polynesian cultural advisors they brought in kept pushing them to give Maui more and more hair, more volume, more presence. And the animation team eventually had to write entirely new software just to render the amount of hair those advisors were asking for. New software from scratch for the hair, because the hair was not a stylistic choice. The hair was a cultural requirement. In Polynesian tradition, hair carries what is called mana, which is spiritual power. Maui's hair is not decoration. It is part of who he is as a figure. It is part of his authority and his mythological identity. So when you spend 10 years talking about how important Maui's hair is, how much care and technology went into it, how much the Pacific Islander advisors pushed you on it, and then you put the live-action version in what the internet has been calling a spirit Halloween wig, what you are communicating is that the cultural significance was only worth respecting when it was free to do so inside a computer. When it cost actual money and actual physical effort in the real world, it dropped to the bottom of the priority list. And the Polynesian community has noticed this pattern for a good long while now. Because before the wig, there was the Halloween costume in 2016, the brown-skinned bodysuit with the tattoos printed on it that scholars called a form of brownface. Disney apologized and pulled that product, but the apology did not erase the pattern. Every stumble gets stacked on top of the ones before it, and when you stack enough of them, people stop giving you the benefit of the doubt. There is also the matter of Maui as a mythological figure specifically, because this is something that gets overlooked when everybody is focused on the wig. Maui is not a character Disney invented. He is a figure from Polynesian oral tradition, viewed by some Pacific Islanders as an ancestor to the ruling class of Hawaii. He is a figure people hold sacred. The animated version of Maui was already criticized by some in the Pacific Islander community for being too frivolous, too vain, too comedic for a figure who carries that kind of weight. Disney also removed his family entirely from the story, which matters a great deal in Polynesian tradition, where family is central to how Maui is understood as a character. So when you put all of that history together, the Halloween costume, the mythological changes, the removal of family, and now a 40-pound bodysuit and a wig that Weird Al Yankovic compared to his own hair in a photo he posted online, you can understand why this particular audience is not feeling generous with its patience. Now, Dwayne Johnson himself said something in an interview that I think tells you a lot more than he maybe meant it to. When somebody asked if he had bulked up for the role, he admitted he was wearing a suit the whole time, and then he said, "I am so happy you said you bulked up, because that means you could not tell." He was happy the prosthetics fooled people. And look, I understand that impulse on a human level. Nobody wants to feel like their costume is failing at its job. But the problem is the paparazzi had already gotten photos from boats out in the water showing visible seams at the neckline. The internet had already seen it. And so when Johnson said he was glad folks could not tell, the folks who absolutely could tell were already out there in numbers. That gap between what he believed people were seeing and what they were actually seeing is the whole Moana live action situation in miniature. What really gets my boots muddy, though, is this one detail from the trailer that I have not heard enough people talking about. There is a moment in that trailer where Moana thanks Maui for something, and Maui turns around and answers, "You're welcome." Now, in isolation, that sounds fine, but the way it is delivered, the way it is framed, it lands different on screen. And folks online have been pointing out that it reads like Disney forcing a moment where Maui is explicitly thanking a woman for something, smiling at her doing it, in a way that feels written to serve a message rather than to serve the story. Now, I ain't gonna tell you that is definitely what was intended, but I will tell you that when an audience has already been primed to look for things like that, when trust has already been eroded, shared and discussed across social media more than you might expect for a few seconds of a 2.5-minute trailer. When the audience is already skeptical, everything gets examined under a microscope. Here is the part that I want y'all to really think about, because this is the business argument underneath everything else. Lilo and Stitch crossed $1 billion on a $100 million budget. Disney learned from that film that you can do right by the source material, respect the culture, actually try, and audiences will reward you for it. The lesson was right there. It was recent, it was clear. And then they turned around and filmed Moana in Atlanta, gave the lead actress a blowout, put a Spirit Halloween wig on the most recognizable bald man in Hollywood, and let insiders go on the record saying less than 5% of the response was negative. That is not a studio that learned from Lilo and Stitch. That is a studio that saw Lilo and Stitch's $1 billion and figured it could get there with or without the effort. And that math might even work out for them. Lilo and Stitch did $1 billion. Moana 2 did over $1 billion. The box office case for the live-action version is real, and Disney knows it. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey opens the very next week on July 17th and will soak up the IMAX screens and adult audiences. But there is going to be a whole demographic of parents with 5- and 6-year-olds who will walk into Moana regardless of what the dislike ratio said in March. That family audience is dependable. Disney is betting on it. And based on the history, the bet is not crazy. But here's the thing about that bet that should concern you if you care about movies being made well. If Moana makes $1 billion despite a 74% dislike ratio on its first trailer, despite being filmed in Georgia, despite the wig, despite the hair contradiction, despite every complaint the audience raised, the lesson Disney is going to take from that is not that they need to do better. The lesson they are going to take is that the audience will show up anyway. And that lesson is going to keep getting reinforced until one day it is wrong. And on the day it is wrong, it is going to be wrong by a lot. Because once audiences genuinely decide to stay home, they do not trickle away. They go all at once. Out here in Texas, we got a saying that is older than dirt and twice as reliable. You can shear a sheep many times, but you can only skin it once. Disney has been shearing these franchises. The question that trailer is forcing us to ask is how many times they think they can do it before somebody decides the whole thing is too thin to bother with anymore. The internet has already told them, in 74% terms. And if they still are not hearing it, well, partner, that sheep is running out of wool real fast.